Hello and welcome to our continuing series on brand safety at the Brand Safety Institute. And today we are super fortunate to have two wonderful ladies who are focused in on news, truth, integrity, and making sure that people are clear about what their choices are as it relates to news. We also know that news is typically in the brand safety scheme, an area that most advertisers are super cautious about. And I think as we talk today with Vanessa Otero from Adfontes Media and Sally Lehrman from the Trust Project, that we'll learn that there are ways to focus in on the quality of news and the suitability of news for your brand. And so let's get started by having you ladies introduce yourselves. So Vanessa, do you want to go first?
Yeah, my name is Vanessa Otero. I'm the founder and CEO of Adfontes Media. I'm based in Westminster, Colorado, and started this company in 2018. I created the original media bias chart that's sort of famous on the internet in 2016, and then ran up to the last election, the last previous presidential election now. And I'm excited to be here.
Great, thank you. Sally?
So hi, everybody. I'm Sally Lehrman, founder and CEO of the Trust Project. I've been a journalist covering science and social issues related to science and business for many, many years, and also being an advocate, I would say, to try to urge journalism to achieve our highest values. And so I started the Trust Project because trust had been declining for decades, really, since 1997, when everything kind of went digital and there was so much confusion, everything looked the same, and journalism was getting worse as a result because we were just trying to chase those metrics. So I thought, well, can we flip the picture and use these algorithms to make journalism stand out as the ethical, professional practice that it really is. And highlight this social responsibility and the practices behind ethical journalism. So now we have 265 and growing news partners around the world, making it easier for the public and the tech platforms algorithms to find trustworthy, ethical news and understand what is behind, who and what is behind a given piece of news.
Great. So so let's dig a little further into sort of the journey for each of you. You know, there are so many perspectives on the rightness of news, truth, integrity, bias, fairness in reporting, all those issues. So can each of you talk me through sort of, you know, what was that real spark for you that led to Adfontes Media and the Trust Project?
It was an interesting spark. So my background, I mean, I'm a English major from UCLA. That's where I got my undergraduate degree, and I ended up being in sales for a number of years. I had a sales career for 10 years. I later went to law school out here in Colorado at the University of Denver, and I practiced as a patent attorney for 6 years. So that sort of surprises a lot of folks when they find out what I do now. But there was a moment that sort of changed the course of my life in 2016. I have always had a passion for news and politics and people having good arguments and and finding agreement even over like very difficult issues. And I had an idea to create, during the run up to the 2016 election, we had people fighting on social media with a level of vitriol that was really disturbing to me. And they would do one thing that was really, I thought, kind of new. Like they would throw links at each other from really extremely left or right news sources, and some of them would be like extremely unreliable news sources, and try to use that to convince each other. And I thought, folks should understand that there are some news sources that are better, some that are worse, some that are left, and some that are right, and some that are extremely so. And in my practice as a patent attorney, I was accustomed to explaining complicated things in both words and pictures, but the pictures are the things that really drive understanding. So I just created this infographic, simple infographic, and I used my background in English and law to sort of construct a taxonomy and methodology for putting together this chart. And I'm a big nerd, so I did this like as a hobby while I was a lawyer. And I just wanted to talk to my friends and family in an effective way online about news and politics. And it went completely viral. It took me by surprise, but it got like 20,000 shares in 24 hours. Millions of people saw it online over the next few months. And I heard from lots of people who have opinions on these topics, as you can imagine. And I didn't know what that opportunity was, but that really it changed my life a lot, because it became this all-consuming blog project for a couple of years. People kept asking for the same things over and over. The first was, what's the data behind this? I'm really interested in this data. And can you add more news sources? Because there are so many news sources out there. News and news-like sources, not quality journalism, but the other things that people get their information from. So I worked at that for a couple of years, figured that there really was an opportunity. And some of my first earliest advisors that I found, through discussions with people on LinkedIn, said, you know what, there's a brand safety implication here. And I actually didn't really know what the brand safety challenges were in this specific field, but there certainly is an opportunity here. So I started as a company in 2018. It's a public benefit corporation. So we're a for-profit enterprise with a stated public mission. It's to rate all the news and to positively transform the media landscape. So here we are a few years later, and we have a team of analysts from left, right, and center that we apply our methodologies to rating news sources across websites, TV and podcasts, we have several thousand news sources rated at the moment, all done, by hand, by people. We're building technology to expand our ratings so that we can actually rate all the news, and we have a data platform for that.
Well, that is an amazing journey. Welcome. Yeah, that's a lot of effort. So Sally, what was the moment that the Trust Project sort of really came into focus, and sort of what was the impetus to get the Trust Project going and start touching news partners across the world?
Yeah, well, I mentioned that back in the late 90s, when news organizations were really struggling to adapt to the digital space, and try to understand even what journalism was, because all these bloggers were coming in, and as a journalist, we were kind of worried. Well, these people are coming in saying they're journalists, and are they really? Do they know the practices of things like impartiality and keeping your opinion out of it and consulting multiple sources? And so I started this thing called the New Media Executive Roundtable, and I think Digital Journalism Ethics something or other. So, and got together all the, I was just head of the Northern California chapter of the Society of Professional Journalism at that time. And so luckily in the Bay Area, we had all these CEOs of major new companies coming in. And for example, we had Jay Singh from CNET, and Richard Gingras who's now at Google, but it was at home at the time, head of Knight Ritter's new digital effort. And so we were talking about, well, how do we bring ethics into this digital space? Because as I said, like, it was just getting worse. And then later, when I had this 5-year appointment as an endowed chair at Santa Clara University, I brought the same group together and brought together a national group to revisit the same questions, and found they were saying the same thing, like the same complaints. And just me being me, I got frustrated and said, we got to do something about this. Why can't we use this space, as I said, for bettering journalism? And just decided to do it. And I talked to a friend at Twitter and talked to Richard, and they both said, oh yeah, all I have to do is just train the algorithm to understand quality journalism. And of course, little did I know that was like a very difficult process. It sounded very simple. So we went out and talked to people about what is it that they value in journalism, and how do they decide whether they trust it? Because we had been engaging just with journalists and talking about it internally for decades. And then what I did was take that information from the public and bring in news executives and have a series of workshops in the traditional user-centered design model and decide, like, how do we marry journalistic values with what people are looking for to try to understand news? And out of that, we came like 37 trust indicators. And of course, that was way too many to ask any journalism site to ever put on their page. So we narrowed it down to 8. And it's a user empowerment model. It's a model where people can look on a news site and find these 8 trust indicators, and each one explains a little bit about the who's behind the news, who are the journalists, who are the people making decisions, what in the sense of what kind of policies, what are the ethics that they have, how do they maintain independence from business or government interests, and so on. How do they decide whether to use unnamed sources, and when do they make corrections? And then most importantly, how do they separate news from opinion and other less clear-cut journalism? So all those things are now placed on pages. We have, we continue to work from a collaborative model. So each time we go into a new country or we work with a new set of sites, we discuss and debate, well, how do we uphold these values and what might need to change in terms of transparency and disclosure to the public?
That's awesome. Awesome. Thank you, ladies. So now sort of get into sort of the meat of it, right? And so we've got these 2 great methodologies to sort of really understand the cadence of news sources. At the end of the day, I think we're all really interested in promoting news as places where advertisers can be. I think, you know, as I talk to people in the industry, people sort of have a good, or people are playing back the idea that brand safety, or at least the floor, is really pretty well understood, if not adhered to. But the real tough question comes into this idea of suitability and what may be right for my brand. What I'd like to dig into at this point is 2 things. So 2-part question. One is, you know, how do you think about your offerings in terms of suitability? And number 2, how do you sort of think about the natural evolution of news topics, because they change over time? So that, you know, for instance, war in Ukraine, at first it was war, right? And then comes sort of more the feature stories about kids getting educated in Poland and yada, yada, yada. And then, of course, we've had, unfortunately, a spate of unfortunate events. We had the incident in Buffalo, we had Uvalde, we had the incident at the hospital in, I think it was Tulsa, and it just lots of stuff coming at us all the time. How do advertisers sort of chart the sort of the natural evolution of a story? If that was a lot, huh?
Look, these are tough questions to wrestle with. I think one thing that we all agree on and we can start with is that when you have, you know, journalism, reputable journalism is foundational. It's super important to the functioning of our society, and brands have an enormous role to play in the monetization of good journalism. They also have a huge role to play in the monetization of extremely polarizing content and misleading content. So there's both the positive responsibility and the to support good journalism, and the opportunity that there is to support good journalism. I'll talk more about the not so good journalism, and I'll because, you know, I think Sally and I, you know, when it comes to the top of the, you know, the cream of the crop, like the most trustworthy sites, I think we'd have very similar things to say on that. Like, it's so important, and, you know, the bottom line is brands should not avoid it. There's other considerations, but when we're talking about the brand safety floor and brand suitability around news, and I expand this to news-like content, it's not just a simple, it's not just news versus opinion, and it's not real news versus fake news, and it's not just, biased versus unbiased. There's really gradients of these things. And that's one of the things that our offering seeks to highlight for folks. So I'll just show you a really quick example because we're all about this visual. So if you've seen the media bias chart, it's a infographic that shows, it shows, news sources from top to bottom, left to right. And this is a very busy looking version of it. Because this has about 1,700 different news sources across websites, TV, and podcasts. And as you see, we have different gradients. So things that are here and up are more trustworthy news sites, about 36 and above. And then below you have things that are, maybe not suitable or below brand safety floor. So here, if you have things that are in the section opinion or high variation and reliability, these can still be problematic for brands, right? Not all brands are going to want to be associated with them, even though they're not, fake news. You have things that are problematic below this line, things that contain misleading information, and the stuff that folks will call disinformation or fake news, that's really at the bottom of this line. And that's really just a small part of the media landscape. There's so much to this landscape here.
I just want to interrupt you for 1 second.
Yeah.
So it's been a while since I looked at that. So I'm looking at Fox News, and how many things are to the right of Fox News? It's frightening.
There are, right? So what folks typically think of are the best known properties on the right or the left, because typically, we're not typically familiar with 1,700 different news sources, right? And just think about, just like in TV and video, this is, 300 different shows. So even within just Fox or MSNBC, you've got, Fox News TV network, but Fox Business is rated higher. There's CNN, MSNBC, but the individual shows are going to be, the ones that are sort of famous for getting boycotted in these bottom corners. There's a well-known one, right? But look how many are also in the same area, right? These are, if a advertiser is going to say this is not suitable for our brand, then what about the rest of the stuff, right? You can't just pick and choose based on like what you're familiar with. And if you want to make sure that you're reaching audiences, on left and right, maybe you want to have a wide berth of folks that you're reaching, then maybe you want to advertise on things that advocate for left-leaning positions and right-leaning positions, but there are ones that are better and worse in those different categories. Maybe from the suitability standpoint, you're a brand that actually has made a stand for liberal or progressive issues, or for conservative issues, right? So we'd want to actively align yourself with those while excluding ones that are extreme, because that's one thing we certainly advocate. I mean, there's below a certain line, it just really shouldn't be acceptable. And the kind of content that's out there, it's really culture war, divisive, the stuff that just rips at the fabric of our society. And if folks are not paying attention to that, I think one reason folks haven't been paying attention to that is because there haven't been great automatic tools to measure this. If you're trying to measure this by keywords, you're really just not going to get there.
Okay, Sally. So Vanessa looks at like the diaspora, right, to give you a range, and I think you go at it from a let's lift the good stuff up for higher visibility. Can you talk through sort of your thoughts around suitability and what advertisers ought to be doing and thinking about?
So I absolutely, and I would echo what Vanessa said too about the role we all have to play in lifting up quality voices within the hubbub of information that's flowing out there. And we feel it's especially important during these troubled times that people can have confidence in their news choices. And of course, there's a corporate responsibility aspect to it. 181 CEOs signed the Business Roundtable pledge to lead their businesses for the benefits of all stakeholders, including employees, including the public. And in fact, that builds profitability and businesses are expected to be doing this. So the Edelman's Trust Barometer is pointing to nearly 60% of consumers buying brands are doing so based on their values and beliefs. So yes, a kind of tool that Vanessa has is useful. Also, it tells us that brands shouldn't be running away from difficult topics. Brands should be out there helping people and supporting the public interest work that journalism is doing. So, and in fact, GARM's brand safety floor offers good guidance. It's not the coverage of sensitive social issues that's the problem per se. It is insensitive, irresponsible, and harmful treatment of social issues and related acts. I'm reading, directly, this is a quote from them, that demean a particular group or incite conflict. So journalism, of course, that's a fundamental of journalism, to be sensitive and responsible on those topics. And what we do at the Trust Project is to ensure that they do. So if you're advertising on a site that is a partner with the Trust Project, they will have made commitments in these areas already. So you can be sure that you are avoiding the brand safety floor. In terms of suitability, educational, informative news around these risky topics are defined as low risk. So again, all of our sites have been vetted and checked for policies that ensure this is the type of coverage they offer. So what we do is we don't just ask sites to put the trust indicators on their site and then let it go at that. First they have to apply to the Trust Project, and they could be very small sites, names that aren't known. They can be relatively new. We do want to see a track record, or they can be big ones. So we have the Washington Post, we have the Capital Daily in Canada, a little tiny site in Canada that just started a year ago. We have BBC, and we have all CTV News and Hearst Television. So again, it's a range. And what we found is these trust indicators do make a difference. So we did an initial study, or we asked an external party to do an initial study. We've done some since. This is just an A/B analysis to see if these trust indicators that we built so carefully really work. And in fact, they do. They increase perceptions of a site's value and perceptions of the site's reliability. They also increase perceptions of a journalist, that they do their homework, so to speak. And so people are willing to spend more time on that site, and as a result spend more time with your ads on that site, and also have a higher value of your ads on that site, because the news trust halo truly is real, as the IAB says. So, and in addition, your brand and your company are associated with the support for free speech, open society, and an informed public, as Vanessa was pointing out.
Right. So the informed public piece of it, I mean, I think your research shows that there is a large slice of the American public that they're not sure about sort of what to believe, right? And so this helps give them some clarity in terms of quality sources, right? So flipping over back to you, Vanessa. So yesterday there was an announcement in Cannes. One of the verification partners said they're taking on the world of podcasting. And I know that in a previous discussion, you're like, people really need to be cross-checking their sources, because they'll avoid something in news or a publication, but then they'll go ahead and buy it in a podcast. And
right.
You want to sort of drive from there?
Yeah, the cross-platform nature of a lot of the most divisive figures in the media is really something that's hard to tackle. And the way that inventory is purchased across TV and video and podcast and audio and across digital, they're not they're very different. But you can have the same personality who has a website website, and that URL can get put on a block list. But then they also have a YouTube channel that maybe escapes that, and that YouTube link can be shared on Twitter and Facebook. They might have a podcast and their own like online video show. So the distribution, it really gets around. So if you're blocking it on one fairly like high profile example, both Alex Jones and Steve Bannon have been kicked off Twitter, right? You know how bad you gotta be to get kicked off major social media platforms. I mean, pretty bad, pretty infamous, right? Lots of strikes against you. However, the sites associated with those folks, they'll change URLs. They'll have like multiple URLs. They'll have YouTube channels, and you can still find those links, find the shared on Twitter. It's there's some gaps there. So there's certainly gaps when it comes to making sure that what you might not tolerate on digital, maybe you feel like you've got that figured out because you have some block lists, but if you're getting into podcasts or you're getting into like online video, it's the wild west out there, because it is hard to automatically do content moderation in these spaces, especially if you're like trying to automatically moderate for something as difficult as debated sensitive social issues with like the GARM framework and like insensitive or demeaning language. I'm telling you, in podcast world, insensitive and demeaning language is like kind of a whole category. I mean, there's so much content out there that just lives in this opinion, dehumanization, vilification, ad hominem attacks of political enemies is like the bread and butter of so many highly engaging podcasts, right? And how podcasts ad networks will promote it is they'll say, well, these are engaged audiences and they have high trust in their creators. Well, exactly what are they trusting them on? The fact that the election was stolen, right? Is that what your brand really wants to be associated with the high trust between the podcast creator and the audience? No, I mean, you really have to look at the content. So, it's a really specific thing that we look at. I'm glad to hear that the verification services are getting into brand safety on podcasts. It's a huge problem to solve. Ours is really squarely focused on the misinformation and polarization aspects of it. So that's why we rate content according to its title. A show title, podcast title. And we've got analysts that will literally sit there, a left, right, and center analyst, listen to several episodes of a podcast before we put our rating on there. So it's a lot of work.
Yeah, indeed. So Sally, 8 trust indicators, one of them is diverse voices. And you sort of, in a previous answer, you kind of touched on this just a little bit, but I just want to drive a little bit deeper, sort of in the post-George Floyd sort of era. People are admittedly more concerned about diversity. Why is it such an important factor for the Trust Project? And what do you think is the benefit of people being courageous as it relates to the stories around diverse populations?
Yeah, thank you for that. And we've done, I hope you can start to see, we do a lot of user research, and we started with the set of user research, and then we did more. We just did around this past summer, not this past summer, 2020, asking these same questions about what do people value in the news, how do they decide whether it's trustworthy, and also more specifically around the 8 trust indicators. One of the things that came out early in the research and continues to be to stick with us is that people are looking for help understanding not just the world, but people different from themselves. So when we first did our research, we looked across, most of the interviews were in the US and Europe, and then we later in the more recent round, we also went up into Canada and did some other locations. And people talked across all these differences consistently about wanting to see more than just people who at high levels of business and government in the news. They really were looking to the news to serve that role of helping them both see themselves represented, but also seeing people different from themselves. And we know that in these hyper-partisan, divisive times, it's very harmful to society and every single individual who lives in it. And so people are even more are looking to news to try to understand how the world is changing and what their own role is and how to navigate within that. So as one person said, and we saw a lot of people actually moving away from news and into hyper-partisan, if you will, silos, because they weren't seeing themselves in the news or because they felt like unfairly portrayed in the news. Or sometimes they would turn to a blog in order to kind of backfill because I don't see my own community, demographic community there. So Kishore in Sacramento, for example, said, I avoid sites that don't hire or promote or show diversity. The diversity of an outlet's staff is super important to me. I take it very personally. So what I'm trying to express is that not only is it a demographic concern, so people are concerned about people of their own identity not being shown in the news. It's also ideology now. So this came up in the more recent research. So, and you can see how this may affect brand perceptions as well, because given this brand halo and the expectations that people have about companies. So diverse voices, this trust indicator, what it does is ask for a commitment on the part of a news organization to inclusive content. And that means at an intentional level, like not just saying that, but actually taking those practices, which are not easy to report across difference, and do it and think about things like implicit bias and how is that shaping the news agenda. We also ask sites to report their staffing data. So gender, race, sexual orientation, and then it may be shifted a little according to different countries. And I've even helped organizations think about, well, how do we incorporate DEI principles into their ethics codes? And how do we think about, again, how do we structure ways to avoid implicit bias into our reporting, into the way we source, into even the way a story is written? And again, like I said earlier, I think this kind of practice and these commitments make it easier for brands to go into those sort of risky places because these companies, these news companies, are being more attentive to sensitive topics like gender and sports, hate crimes, and so on. And so you can be in a place where these issues are being addressed, where we know the public is concerned about them. People want to see these issues voiced and debated and discussed. They want to see themselves represented. And so a brand can be in a space that is safe and suitable because a news organization has put extra care into it.
That is awesome. Thank you. Great perspective. Vanessa, anything that you want to touch on there?
Yeah, I totally agree with Sally. You know, the extent to which reputable, trustworthy news organizations can respectfully, include diverse voices and tell stories from multiple perspectives. You know, the less need there would be to fill that void with these like hyper-partisan echo chambers, because the further down and to the right and left you get dragged, like the more it's explicit bias, like it's purposefully biased. I mean, the culture war kind of content that dehumanizes and explicitly attacks trans people, especially in like right-wing media. Like right now, it's extremely harmful. So I agree with the importance of having such diverse voices within reputable organizations and having that commitment to it. We see for us, a diversity among viewpoint diversity among our analysts is really important. Helps us spot other people's blind spots. That's why we have a right-leaning, left-leaning, and center-leaning person looking at each article, and they do it together, right? So they can point out each other's blind spots. So they can point out each other's blind spots. You think that would be difficult given all the very sensitive topics that we're reading about in the news all the time, everything, abortion and race and guns and all of it, right? But they're able to come to common ground because they see how these stories are being reported across the news landscape. But the diversity across other personal characteristics is just as important, because age and race and gender and where people come from also contribute to them being able to showcase their experiences and point out other folks' blind spots, and they can do it in a respectful way when you have diverse voices like coming together.
Great.
And Louis, if I can add something, is it all right? Can I add a little something?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Because what I also want to raise you asked about responsibility of brands, and I really feel that advertisers do need to step up. And some of our most recent research alarmed me, along with some things I've been reading about why people get pulled into really hostile camps and into racism, into sexism, and all these other places and are willing to act on it. In our work, we were able to identify 4 different user types. And what you were referring to earlier was this anxious middle. So we have like the avid news user who's cross-checking the news, very confident in what they're seeing and how to share it. Then you've got the other extreme, people who've already been like taken over by falsehood. And they're also very confident. But you've got folks in the middle who we call the avid, who is like a subscriber, pays consistent attention, and people who we used to call opportunistic, just there when news washes over them. And they've all become more engaged. But those 2 middle categories, and I actually say everybody was more anxious about making decisions. Is this trustworthy or not? Will I get fooled? Will I get tricked? And anxiety like that, and particularly this anxious middle, those are people who are most vulnerable to inflammatory falsehoods, because it gives them the confidence. It says, trust me because I can tell you, I have the answers. I have this conspiracy theory that explains everything. So this is why it's so important for journalism to fill that gap by answering the needs of telling people about people like themselves and people unlike themselves, providing that sort of knitting together of community that really no other kind of organization does or institution does, and why we need advertisers, brands to really support that effort, because it's a critical moment right now for society.
Absolutely. So that gets me to sort of the last question. So, between the sort of anxious middle and the culture wars. So right now, we're going through primaries and the run-ups to the midterms and the January 6th hearings, like just, bonus round. Where do you think we are as a nation? And, how do we cast ourselves better into the future?
We're at, it's hard, it's cliche to say unprecedented times. We've heard that a lot over the last couple of years, but I think the biggest perspective, insight that our work has given myself and people that I work with is you really don't know what other people are consuming for content. And it really affects people. I mean, think about how much content each of us has the capability to consume in one particular day. It's not a lot, right? We have to make choices. We've got busy lives. So, if you choose to listen to a podcast for a few hours, or a TV show, or you have your cable news on for a few hours, or you just like check your apps or your news feed, whatever it is, wherever it is you get your news from, it's usually a function of either you visit those news sources out of habit or by algorithm. And those get honed in like more and more over time. So often people aren't getting their news from more than like maybe 3 to 5 news sources at the most on a regular basis. And often they're very, very similar to each other. And so if you live in like this, like the top middle, I'll just use my chart as a visual. Like if you live here, this is where your news sources come from. It may like very much shock you when you go to the proverbial Thanksgiving dinner and you hear something coming out of your relative's mouth that you just sounds absolutely ludicrous and like insensitive and awful to you. But that might be a result of the type of media, like the 3 to 5 news sources that they're consuming over here on this bottom corner or this bottom corner.
Which is their middle, right?
They're like, this is the universe, right? We talk about alternative realities. Look, I know that January 6th hearings are being played on TV, and some of them even in prime time. And a lot of people they will never consume that content. Like they will watch a show that will not show them that content, right? So we live in this like really fractured media ecosystem, and it's extremely important for those of us who care about solving the problems of this fractured media ecosystem with alternative realities, which we can see the damage from. It's really important that we pay attention to what is everywhere in the media ecosystem. Like, look at it. Reading something extremely, left-wing and extremely right-wing and extremely unreliable, and then comparing that to something that's like, what we all would consider trustworthy journalism, it's just universes away from each other. And if you don't understand that other folks are consuming that, and that you as a company, you as a brand have a role in all of that, then we're not going to be able to solve these problems. So awareness is one of the first steps.
Sally?
Yeah, well, I will say that, first of all, as I was mentioning, people are craving accurate information. So that's a good thing. We found, and we did a study with Ipsos, the international research firm, and 85% of people globally said that they sought out trustworthy news. So, and as Vanessa's pointing out too, like, what can that mean? So we need to help people understand what trustworthy news really means. And there's a lot of, we're going to see a lot more heat, a lot more fear mongering around demographic differences. We're going to see bold falsehoods. We are continuing to see more attacks on journalists and journalism. So a lot of efforts to discredit the news. So what I would like to urge everybody listening to do is, number one, on a personal level, there's several things could be done. But first of all, when you're confronting or encountering, it's a better word, someone who has very different views than you, or actually is spouting falsehoods and repeating falsehoods, use the truth sandwich. And that means what you do is tell them what is true, repeat what they said, and then tell the truth again. So it's about like encapsulating, hearing what they're saying, and then responding with some accuracy after that. So this is something journalists are doing more and more, and you can do it on an individual level as well, because some of it is about feeling heard, and then also providing the answer to, for example, that anxious middle, and look for that anxious middle, because those are the folks that can be affected and helped. And that's where the trust indicators come in too, at a personal level. We're discovering, I didn't really think about this initially, but we're using them more and more as a news literacy tool. So think about how you can teach people with the 8 trust indicators. We even have a program right now that we're starting where we're asking people to become ambassadors for trust indicators, which means that we work with you just to promote them and help people at a broader level know how to assess trustworthy news and ease that anxiety. And then as a company, just recognizing that essential role of advertisers in supporting trustworthy news. And, this is where these lists and these approaches, where news organizations are stepping up to show we have better practices and we're continuing to improve our practices. This is where we can really be of help.